Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. My name is Margaret Evans. I'm 64 years old, and for 8 long years, I lived with a gaping hole in my heart. A thick, heavy silence. A silence that wasn't one of peace or rest, but of rejection, of silent pain. My only daughter, Emily, stopped speaking to me. Not because of an accident. Not because of a devastating quarrel. No. This icy silence was born the day I dared to ask for a divorce. It may seem banal, almost ordinary today. But in my family, it was an earthquake. I was married to James Evans for 32 years. An upright, respected, and well-liked man. He taught constitutional law at Boston University and was often invited to lectures and intellectual panels. He shone in society. I was a librarian at a public school, a discreet, serious woman, invested in books and children. Together, we had that appearance that other couples envied: stability, elegance, education. But all this was just an empty shell. Behind the walls of our beautiful colonial house in Brookline, there was neither laughter nor warmth. No shouting, no arguments, but a bitter silence. A daily indifference, a distance measured not by the meter, but by the soul. We lived like two colleagues forced to share the same office, each immersed in their own routine, their own world. James would come home late, eat quickly, then disappear into his office with a bottle of scotch. Not a glance. Not a hand on my shoulder. Not even a, "How was your day, Margaret?" Sometimes I wondered if I hadn't become a piece of furniture in this house, useful, silent, always in my place. But I held on. For Emily. She was our treasure, our only child. I wanted her to have a sweet, stable childhood. For her to believe that her parents were a bulwark against the world. So I smiled. I cooked meals. I organized birthday parties, sewed her costumes for school plays, stuck tender notes on the refrigerator door. I stifled my tears at night so she wouldn't hear me crying in the bathroom. I remember one particular Christmas. She was 12 years old. James had forgotten to buy the gift she'd asked for. He gave her an envelope with money. She looked at him, disappointed, but said nothing. I was the one who went out to buy what she wanted the next day, pretending it was a belated surprise from her father. I often felt like both mother and father, emotionally speaking. And yet, despite all my efforts, I saw Emily growing closer to her father as she grew older. He had the charisma, the presence, the way he spoke loudly and confidently at family dinners. I was the reassuring, but inconspicuous, shadow. The day Emily left home for college in New York, I felt a frightening emptiness. Not the emptiness of a room suddenly too quiet, but the emptiness of scaffolding collapsing. It was as if I'd been standing all these years just for her, and now that she was gone, I didn't know why I stayed. I remember that evening, sitting in the kitchen. Dinner was ready, as always. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 silences. James arrived, ate, got up, and said, "Good night," without looking up from his plate. The banality of the scene shattered me. I cleaned the table, washed the glasses, and then went to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. My salt and pepper hair was neatly combed. My blouse was ironed. Everything seemed in order. But my eyes were empty. And then, out loud, as if to awaken something in me, I said, "Margaret, you're not dead." Not yet. I held the gaze of my own reflection. It was like meeting myself for the first time in years. And that was the beginning of the end. Or perhaps, the beginning of a beginning. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, I sat across from James in our cold, immaculately tidy living room. He was reading the Wall Street Journal, as always, glasses on his nose, a half-empty whiskey on his right side. I was holding a cup of tea that I hadn't touched. My hands were shaking. He looked up, briefly, before I said anything. As if he already knew. "James. I want a divorce." No immediate reaction. No shock. Not even a frown. He just closed his newspaper, put down his glasses, sighed deeply, then nodded. Do you want to ruin everything now, after all these years? He didn't scream. He didn't cry. His voice was neutral, almost jaded, as if he were responding to a bad weather forecast. I stared at him in disbelief. Part of me, even after all this time, hoped he'd try. That he'd tell me he still loved me, that he didn't want to lose me, that we could try, change, rebuild. But no. He stood up, retrieved his glass, and walked toward the office without another word. That was it, our last night as husband and wife. A few days later, I was packing my boxes. I took only the essentials, a few clothes, some books, 2 picture frames, and a houseplant that hadn't flowered in years, a silent symbol of my married life. I took a small, modest apartment in Salem, 40 minutes outside of Boston. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom with no wall mirrors. But it was mine. For the first time in so long, I breathed air that didn't bear the imprint of a selfless man. The first few days were difficult. The silence of the house was different, heavier at times, but also more genuine. I cried into my sheets, alone. But it was a grief of healing, not one of resignation. Little by little, I rebuilt. I joined a book club at the public library. There I met Nancy, a funny and biting widow, who dragged me to literary trivia nights and maple syrup brunches. I started traveling alone, with a light suitcase and a notebook in which I jotted down my impressions. I discovered Santa Fe, Savannah, and even a small village in Quebec where no one knew me and where I spent hours walking aimlessly, just to feel my legs exist. I took pottery classes, and my first vases looked like accidents of nature, but I loved to plunge my hands into them, to feel the living clay under my fingers. I found myself laughing at an Indian cooking class when I accidentally spilled turmeric all over my apron. I even danced Latin, in a room packed with women and men younger than me, but who applauded me when I did 2 steps together without stumbling. I was alive again. Finally. More Emily. Emily didn't follow me. I remember the day I called her. I had prepared what I wanted to say, weighed every word. My heart was pounding so hard my throat was tight. When she answered, her voice was distant, hurried. Mom? What's wrong? I spoke to her gently. I tried to explain that this divorce wasn't a betrayal, but an attempt at survival. That I loved her. That I wanted her to understand. But she cut me off, sharply. You're selfish, Mom. Dad is devastated. You abandoned him. I froze. How could I tell him that he was the one who had abandoned me years ago? That he was no longer there, even when he was sitting right in front of me? That he no longer saw me, that he never listened to me? Emily, you don't know the whole story. No, and I don't want to know her. You're not the mother I knew anymore. And then I understood. Not just that she resented me, but that she had chosen sides. That she preferred the perfect image, the reassuring father, the apparent stability, to the messy truth of my suffering. That she didn't want to know, because knowing would force her to doubt. And that was the end. The phone hung up, but it was my heart she had disconnected. 8 years of staring at my phone screen every day, hoping for a message, a call, a notification, anything, from Emily. But there was nothing. Not a word at Christmas. Not a, happy birthday, Mom, even a rushed one. She never responded to my cards, even the ones I shyly slipped into her inbox, half-heartedly. She didn't come to the funeral of my sister Helen, her favorite aunt. She didn't deign to respond to my Thanksgiving invitations, while I cooked alone in my small kitchen, surrounded by a silence that was too thick. She ignored her cousin Daniel's wedding, even though he had always been like a big brother to her. I was scratched. Erased from her world. Erased from her history. The few scraps of information I managed to gather came indirectly. A former neighbor, Mr. Lindell, once told me that he saw a picture of Emily in a local Portland magazine at a tech gala. A former colleague at the library, who had a cousin working in the same field, told me that Emily had gotten married. Her husband's name was Charles Whitmore, a name far too cold for my taste. A software engineer, apparently brilliant, very ambitious. A polite but distant man, from what I gathered. They lived in a modern house in Portland, Oregon, on the other side of the country, as far away as you could get, both geographically and emotionally. I went to look at their online profiles. At first, there were a few public posts, photos of trips, parties, conferences. But no images of me, no memories of our past life. My digital presence had been erased. Even the photos of his childhood that I had taken myself had disappeared from his albums. In their place, frozen smiles, impeccable landscapes, brunches with friends. And there I was, like a ghost. Alive, but absent. I continued to write to him. Letters, sometimes long, sometimes very short. Sometimes a simple sentence. I loved you from the first beat of your heart. Or, I'm sorry, even for what you refused to hear. I never sent these letters. I kept them in a box, in my desk drawer, neatly folded. Because every attempt at contact was also an attempt at survival, but I wasn't sure I wanted to survive another rejection. The worst part isn't the absence. It's the thought that our love can be so easily forgotten. I learned to live with this emptiness. He didn't disappear, but he became a sort of silent roommate. He sat with me in the morning at breakfast, kept me company on walks by the water, invited himself into my dreams, and woke me up in the middle of the night. Over time, I began to speak of her in the past tense, almost mechanically. When someone asked me if I had children, would answer. Yes, I have a daughter, Emily. She lives in Portland. But, we haven't spoken in a long time. And people nodded, embarrassed, not knowing whether to ask questions. Most didn't dare. I kept her photos in an album at the back of my closet. I hardly looked at them anymore. It was too painful to see that little dimpled smile, those eyes full of light, and to remember that one day, those same eyes had looked at me with adoration. I was his mother. His refuge. And now, I was the memory of a betrayal. And then, that morning. A cold Sunday in January. The kind of morning when the world seems frozen, suspended in a kind of icy silence. The gray light barely filtered through the living room curtains, and outside, the city was covered in a thin film of frost. It seemed as if even time was hesitant to move forward. I got up early, as always. I made my black coffee and 2 slices of toast. The radio played soft, almost imperceptible music. Sitting in my chair by the window, I watched the breath of my own sigh fog up the glass. Routine. Calm. Cold. Solitary. That's when the phone rang. The screen displayed, unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it. I too often receive robocalls or ridiculous offers for solar panels. But something, a shiver down my spine, a feeling I can't explain, made me pick up. Hello? A silence. Then a breath, panting, charged with emotion. And then, that voice. That voice I hadn't heard in almost a decade. Trembling, choked with fear, but undeniably hers. Mom? My hand slipped. My mug slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor with a thud, splattering the carpet with hot coffee. But I didn't move. I stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, gasping for air. Emily? My voice was just a breath. A prayer. She didn't answer right away. I could only hear her breathing, uneven, as if she'd been holding back tears for too long. Charles is gone. His voice was hoarse, strangled. He asked for a divorce. He told me I'd become distant. Cold. Closed. A silence. Then, like a stab. Like you. After the divorce. I closed my eyes. I sat up straight in my chair, as if my body suddenly had to contain itself so as not to collapse entirely. My heart was pounding. A mixture of pain, fear, and gratitude. Emily continued, her voice trembling, as if the words cost her a part of herself. I understood things. What you must have felt. What you were going through, trapped in this marriage. What I refused to listen to. I felt my tears welling up, burning, uncontrollable. I let them flow. Every word she spoke tore away a layer of ice in my heart, a layer I had built up over the years to keep me moving forward. She was silent for a few seconds, and then, in a softer, almost childlike voice. I want to see you. If you still want me. And there. I couldn't hold back the sob. A deep, animal sob, coming from that place deep inside me that I thought was dead. My shoulders trembled. My face buried itself in my hands. She was coming back. My daughter. My child. My love. After 8 years of absence, of silence, of pain. She was crossing the border into the past. And she was reaching out. I stammered through my tears. Always. Always, Emily. You always belong here. There was nothing else to say. Nothing more true. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, the sky hung low, threatening rain. I waited by my living room window, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. I stared out at the empty street, my heart pounding like a girl's before her first date. It had been 8 years. 8 years of silence, of distance, of frozen pain. And now she was coming. Then I saw her. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, her face half hidden under an oversized coat, the one she'd worn when she was 17, the sleeves always hanging a little too far down her wrists. In her right hand, a worn black suitcase, as if she'd walked a long way before arriving here. And in the other hand, a photograph. When I opened the door, our eyes met. And everything froze. She was no longer the lively teenager I had known, nor the young adult I had imagined in my memories. Her face was tired, marked by sleepless nights, sorrows we don't share, regrets we keep silent. Without a word, she entered. She took off her shoes slowly, as if afraid of disturbing the floor. She set her suitcase in the corner of the hallway, then walked over to the wooden table in the living room, where so many memories remained suspended in the air. She held out the photo. A picture of her and me at her senior prom. She was wearing a navy dress, I was wearing a cream blouse. We were laughing. Our heads tilted together, our gazes knowing. That day, I remember, she said to me. Never let go of my hand, Mom. She placed the photo on the table, gently, as one would place a piece of fragile glass. Then she whispered, her voice breaking. Can we start again? I didn't answer right away. My throat was tight, my eyes misty. I simply nodded and took his hand. We talked all night. Sitting on the old beige sofa, our feet curled up beneath us, a blanket over our knees, just like in the old days. The fire crackled gently in the fireplace, as if to warm our hearts, frozen by the lost years. She cried. Thick, silent tears. Tears of shame, remorse, fatigue. Me too. Our tears mingled, washing away years of resentment. She told me about her marriage to Charles, the brilliant beginnings, the deceptive complicity, the large photos and the small silences. Then the slow erosion. Charles's changing gaze. The veiled reproaches. The feeling of being invisible, a stranger to herself. And then this sentence, coming out like a clap of thunder in the middle of a murmur. I wanted to believe you were the monster. Because it was easier than admitting that Dad didn't love you anymore. She looked down, ashamed. I remained silent. I didn't try to reassure her. Or to confirm. I didn't reopen the wounds. I just reached out. She took it. And our fingers closed around each other, as if they had never stopped searching for each other in the darkness. That night she stayed to sleep. In her old room, which I'd never touched. I'd left her childhood books there, her poetry notebooks, the drawings she used to hang on the wall. Even her old teddy bear, with its sewn-on ears, still sat on the pillow. When she entered, she placed her hand on the desk, then on the picture frame. And suddenly, she collapsed in tears. Not just of sadness, but of return. Of a kind of silent recognition that nothing had been erased here, not even her. The next morning, I made her pancakes, just like I used to. She ate them slowly, her eyes shining, saying to me, "It's strange how some things can remain intact, even when you've lost your way." Since that day, she comes back to see me every month. Sometimes just for a cup of tea. Sometimes to tell me about her new life, her readings, her doubts. She sends me messages, photos of her walks, of her cooked meals, even of her new attempts at pottery. And a few weeks ago, she said to me, "You know, if you want, we could go away together this summer. Just you and me. A mother-daughter trip. We could go to Savannah, or even Quebec, like you told me in your letters." Yes, she had read my letters. The ones I had never sent. And then there was this gift, discreet, simple but overwhelming. A small, light-colored wooden frame wrapped in tissue paper. Inside, a handwritten quote. "Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it can write a future." And below, in round writing, recognizable among all, "I love you, Mom. Thanks for waiting."